I want to start off by saying that if you want an answer at the end, prepare to be disappointed. There isn't one. I was an intern at Nickelodeon Studios for a year in 2005 for my degree in animation. It wasn't paid, of course, but most internships aren't. It did have some perks beyond education, though. To adults, it might not seem like a big one, but most kids at this time would have shit themselves over it. Since I worked directly with the editors and animators, I got to view the new episodes days before they were aired. I'll get right down to it without giving too many unnecessary details. They had very recently made the SpongeBob movie, and the entire staff was somewhat sapped of creativity, so it took them a little bit longer to start up the new season, but the delay lasted for longer for more upsetting reasons. There was a problem with the Season 4 premiere that set everyone and everything back for several months. 2 other interns and I were in the editing room along with the lead animators and sound editors for the final cut. We received the copy that was supposed to be Fear of a Krabby Patty, and gathered around the screen to watch. Now, given that it isn't final yet, animators often put up a mock title card as a little inside joke, with phony, oftentimes shrewd titles such as How Sex Doesn't Work instead of Rockabye Bealv, the episode where SpongeBob and Patrick adopt a baby sea scallop. There's nothing particularly funny except for the few work-related chuckles, so when we saw the title card, Squidward's Suicide, we didn't think it more than a morbid joke. One of the interns did a small throat laugh at it. The happy-go-lucky music played as normal. The story began with Squidward practicing his clarinet, hitting a few sour notes as normal. We hear SpongeBob laughing outside, and Squidward stops, yelling at him to keep it down, as he had a concert that night and needed to practice. SpongeBob complains and goes to see Sandy with Patrick. The Bubbles Splash screen comes up and we see the ending of Squidward's concert. This is where things begin to seem off. While playing, a few frames repeat themselves, but the sound doesn't. At this point, sound is synced up with animation, so yes, that's not common. But when he stops playing, the sound finishes as if the skip never happened. There's a slight murmuring in the crowd before they begin to boo him. This wasn't the normal cartoon booing that's common in the show. You could clearly hear malice in it. Squidward was in full frame and looked visibly afraid. The shot goes to the crowd with SpongeBob in center frame. He too is booing, which is very much unlike him. That isn't the oddest thing though. What's odd is that everyone had hyper-realistic eyes. They were very detailed. They weren't shots of real people's eyes, but something a bit more real than CGI. The pupils were red too. Some of us looked at each other, obviously confused, but since we weren't the writers, we didn't question its appeal to children. Yet. The shot goes to Squidward as he sat on the edge of his bed, looking very forlorn. The view out of his porthole window was of a night sky, so it wasn't very long after the concert. At this point, there was no sound. There was literally no sound. There wasn't even feedback from the speakers in the room. It was as if the speakers were turned off, though their status shows them working perfectly. He simply sat there, blinking, in this silence for about 30 seconds, until he began to sob softly. He put his tentacles over his eyes and cried quietly for a full minute more. All the while, a sound in the background slowly growing from nothing to barely audible. It sounded like a slight breeze through a forest. The screen slowly began to zoom in on his face. By slowly, I mean it was only noticeable if you look at shots 10 seconds apart, side by side. His sobbing got louder and more full of hurt and anger. The screen twitches a bit for a split second, as if it twisted in on itself, then returned normal. The wind through the trees sound got slowly louder and more severe, as if a storm was brewing somewhere. The eerie part was that this sound and Squidward's sobbing sounded real. As if the sound wasn't coming from the speakers, but as if the speakers were holes the sound was coming through from the other side. A good quality, as the studio likes to have, they don't purchase the equipment to be that good to produce sound of that quality. Below the sound of the wind and sobbing, very faint, something sounded like laughing. It came at odd intervals and never lasted more than a second, so you had a hard time pinning it. After 30 seconds of this, the screen blurred and twitched violently as something flashed over the screen, as if one single frame was replaced. The lead animation editor paused and rewound frame by frame, and what we saw was horrible. It was a still photo of a dead child. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The face was mangled and bloodied, and one eye was popped and dangling over his upturned face. He was naked, down to his underwear, and his stomach was crudely cut open with his entrails laying beside him. He was laying on some pavement that was probably a road. The most upsetting part was that there was the shadow of the photographer. There was no crime tape, no evidence bags or markers, and the angle was completely off for a shot designed to be for evidence. It would seem the photographer was the person responsible for the child's death. We were of course mortified, but pressed on, hoping it was just a sick joke. The screen flipped back to Squidward, still sobbing. He was louder than before, and only half of his body was in frame. There was now what appeared to be blood running down his face from his eyes. The blood was also done in hyper-realistic style, looking as if you touched it, you'd get blood on your fingers. The wind sounded now as if it were a gale blowing through a forest. There were even snapping sounds of branches. The laughing, a deep baritone, lasted at longer intervals and came more frequently. After about 20 seconds, the screen again twisted and showed a single-frame photo. The editor was reluctant to go back, as we all were, but he knew he had to. This time, the photo was that of what appeared to be a little girl, no older than the first child. She was lying on her stomach, her barrettes in a pool of blood next to her. Her left eye, too, popped out, and she was naked except for her underpants. Her entrails were piled on top of her above a crude cut along her back. Again, the body was on the street, and the photographer's shadow was visible. It was very similar in size and shape to the first. I had to choke back vomit, and one intern, the only female in the room, ran out. The show resumed. About 5 seconds after this second photo played, all sound stopped, like it was when the scene started. He put his tentacles down, and his eyes were done in hyperrealism, like the others were in the beginning of this episode. They were bleeding, bloodshot and pulsating. He stared at the screen, as if watching the viewer. After 10 seconds, he started sobbing, though not covering his eyes. The sound was piercing and loud, and most fear-inducing of all was his sobbing. It was mixed with screams. Tears and blood were dripping down his face at heavy rate. The wind sound came back, so did the deep voice laughing. The next still photo lasted for a good 5 frames. The animator was able to stop it on the 4th and back up. This time, the photo was of a boy, about the same age as the other children, but the scene was different. The entrails were just being pulled out from a stomach wound by a large hand, and the right eye was popped and dangling with blood trickling down it. The animator proceeded. It was hard to believe, but the next one was different, though we couldn't tell how. He went on to the next, and it was the same thing. Then he went back to the first and played them quicker. I lost it, vomiting on the floor. The animating and sound editors were gasping at the screen. The 5 frames were not as if they were 5 different photos. They were played as if they were frames from a video. We saw the hand slowly lift out the guts. We saw the kid's eyes focus on it. And we even saw 2 frames of the kid beginning to blink. The lead sound editor told us to stop. He had to call in the creator to see it. Mr. Hillenberg arrived within 15 minutes. He was confused as to why he was called down there, so the editor continued the episode. Once the few frames were shown, all screaming, all sound again stopped. Squidward was staring at the viewer, his entire face in the frame, for about 3 seconds. The shot quickly panned out, and in that deep voice said, "Do it." The next thing we see is a shotgun in Squidward's hands. He immediately puts the gun in his mouth and pulls the trigger. Realistic blood and brain matter splattered the wall and bed behind him, and he flies back from the force. The last 5 seconds of the episode show his body on the bed, on his side, with one eye dangling on what's left of his head above the floor, staring blankly at it. Then the episode ends. Mr. Hillenberg was obviously angry about it. He demanded to know what the hell was going on. Most people left the room at this point, so it was just a handful of us to watch it again. Viewing the episode twice only served to imprint the entirety of it into my mind and caused me horrible nightmares. I'm sorry I stayed. The only theory we could think of was that someone in the chain from the drawing studio to here edited the file. The CTO was called in to analyze when it happened. The analysis of the file did show it was edited over by new material. However, the timestamp of it happening was mere 24 seconds before we began viewing it. All equipment involved was examined for foreign software and hardware, as well as glitches, as if the timestamp may have glitched and showed the wrong time, but everything checked out fine. We don't know what happened, and to this day, nobody does. There was an investigation due to the nature of the photos, but nothing came of it. No child scene was identified and no clues were gathered from the data involved or physical clues in the photos. I never believed in unexplainable phenomena before, but now that I have, if something happens and I can't prove anything about it beyond anecdotal evidence, I think twice about things.